So if you go back to the year 1611, there's this incredibly specific verse about fighting, the darkest forces in the universe. And it was just cemented right into the English Bible.
Right, the King James Version.
Exactly. And the verse claimed that certain demons could, they could only be cast out through prayer and fasting.
Right. It was highly specific instructions for spiritual warfare.
Yeah. But if you open a modern Bible today and you turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, and you read down to verse 21, you're going to find a glaring literal hole.
It's just not there.
It's completely gone,
Yeah.
erased. And, it leaves you wondering, right? Why on earth would modern scholars just delete a verse about spiritual warfare?
It sounds like a conspiracy, honestly.
It totally does. But to answer that question and to really understand this mystery that spans, 2,000 years, we have to start by hiking up a very specific mountain in the first century.
Yeah, and that historical mystery, it's really just the tip of the iceberg here. Because what happens on that mountain and then in the valley immediately below it, it captures what I think is the ultimate human paradox.
How so?
Well, we all want to live on the spiritual peaks, right? We crave those moments of profound clarity where everything just makes sense.
Yeah, the mountaintop experience.
Exactly. But life inevitably, drags us back down into the deepest, messiest, just most chaotic valleys of human suffering.
Man, that is so true. And that transition from the peak down to the valley, that is the entire mission of our deep dive today.
It's a rough transition.
It really is. And our primary roadmap for this journey, the lens we're using, is this profound sermon from the Church of 1122.
Often just called 1122.
Right, well, 122. And they unpack this exact paradox by looking at the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain and then his immediate descent into the chaos of a suffering crowd down below.
Which is such a striking contrast.
It's jarring. And to fully grasp what the 1122 pastor is teaching here, we're bringing in some really heavy supplemental firepower for this deep dive.
We've got a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah. We're looking at historical commentaries from theologians like John Calvin and Charles Spurgeon.
Heavy hitters.
The heaviest.
Yeah.
Plus, we're analyzing the ancient Greek, and we're going to dive deep into the textual criticism that actually explains that missing verse. We're exploring the massive tension between divine glory and human brokenness.
And I love that the 1122 sermon is serving as our core diagnostic tool for all of this. Because, the text itself might be 2 millennia old, but the way they preach it, it reads like a modern psychological evaluation.
Oh, 100%. It feels incredibly current.
Yeah, it directly addresses things like our modern anxieties, self-sabotage, and this is a big one, the furious internet arguments that seem to define our current culture.
And you've all been there.
Right. But to understand the cure for that valley-level chaos, we really have to start up on the mountaintop. We need to understand who is actually leading us down into the dark.
Okay, so let's set the scene before we even start the hike. We're in Matthew 17 and Mark 9. And the text notes that this happens 6 days after a really major turning point at a place called Caesarea Philippi.
Right, which is where Peter first confesses that Jesus is the Messiah.
Exactly. So from there, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up what text just calls a, quote, high mountain. Now, I know for hundreds of years, religious tourism basically claimed this was Mount Tabor, right?
Yeah, tradition definitely favors Mount Tabor. But when we look at the supplemental historical and geographical data, a lot of scholars actually point toward Mount Hermon instead.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, you have to consider the physical and political geography of the time. So Tabor is relatively short, actually. And in the first century, it had this fortified Roman military settlement perched right on top of it.
Oh, wow. I had no idea about the fort.
Yeah, so it would hardly be this secluded environment for private, universe-altering revelation. You'd have Roman guards walking around.
That definitely ruins the vibe.
Right. But Mount Hermon, conversely, it looms massive over the region. It's snow-capped, and it sits very close to Caesarea Philippi, which is where they had just been staying.
So it makes a lot more geographical sense.
Exactly. The sheer elevation and the isolation of Hermon just fit the narrative of going up a high mountain apart by themselves much, much better.
And the isolation feels entirely necessary when you look at what actually happens next. Because they hike up this massive peak, and the text says Jesus was transfigured before them.
Which is a heavy word.
It is. The Greek root there is metamorphethi, and the descriptions in the text are just wild to read. It says, his face shines like the sun, his clothes become dazzling white.
And Mark's gospel is funny here. He points out it's not just clean, it's radiating a light whiter than any earthly launderer could possibly bleach them.
Right, like no amount of first century bleach is doing this.
It is a staggering visual, and I think our modern brains usually misinterpret the mechanics of it.
What do you mean?
Well, we tend to imagine the scene like a theatrical production, you know? We assume God the Father basically shines a divine spotlight down from the clouds onto Jesus.
Oh, sure, like a beam coming down from heaven.
Yeah, but Charles Spurgeon's commentary, which we found in the Enduring Words supplement, he corrects that assumption beautifully.
Okay, lay it on me.
Spurgeon says the miracle on the Mount of Transfiguration is not that Jesus suddenly acquires a glory he didn't previously possess.
So it's not an upgrade.
Not at all. Spurgeon argues that the ongoing, everyday miracle of the Incarnation was that the eternal, blinding glory of the Son of God was actively being veiled by human flesh.
Wow.
Yeah, he walked around every single day suppressing his divine nature. So on the mountain, he simply stops hiding.
That's a crazy shift in perspective.
It really is. It's like the zipper of his humanity comes down just an inch, and the uncreated light of his divine nature radiates outward from within. It's a metamorphosis of manifestation, not of acquisition.
Okay, I love that. So it's less like a spotlight hitting a stage actor and more like opening the heavy lead doors of a nuclear reactor core.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the power is always there. It's always humming. It's just normally shielded for the safety of everyone around it.
Yeah.
And on the mountain, he just lifts the shielding.
Exactly. But Jesus isn't alone in the glow either.
Right. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah are just standing there having a conversation with him, which out of all the legendary figures in Jewish history, I mean, you have Abraham, David, Isaiah, why does the narrative bring these two specific figures back from the dead?
Because their presence is a massive theological endorsement.
In what way?
Well, in the Jewish mind, Moses is the undisputed representative of the law, right? The foundational covenant that was delivered at Sinai.
Okay.
And Elijah stands as the ultimate representative of the prophets. He's the voice of God's ongoing revelation and correction to the people.
So the law and the prophets.
Exactly. Together, that phrase was basically the shorthand for the entire Hebrew Bible. So by having Moses and Elijah appear in glory and converging on Jesus, it visually proves to the disciples that the entire Old Testament is bearing witness to him.
He isn't abolishing their work. He's the culmination of it.
Spot on.
So the 1122 sermon dives specifically into what these three were actually talking about. Because Luke's parallel account gives us some insider details. It says they were speaking about his, quote, departure, which he was about to accomplish down in Jerusalem.
Right, but the actual Greek word used for departure there is deeply loaded. It's exodos.
Exodus,
Right.
the book of Exodus.
Exactly. And the 1122 pastor leans heavily into the mechanics of that word. They aren't just discussing a generic death, they are mapping out the ultimate exodus.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, think of what the original Exodus accomplished. Moses led the Israelites out of 400 years of brutal slavery in Egypt. And the mechanism for that liberation was the Passover.
Right, the lamb.
Right. God instructed the people to take a spotless lamb, sacrifice it, and paint its blood on the wooden doorposts of their homes.
So when the angel of death swept through the land, it saw the blood and passed over those houses.
Exactly. The judgment still fell, but it was absorbed by the lamb, resulting in the freedom of the people.
Okay, so on the mountain, you have Moses, the human architect of the first Passover consulting with Jesus, who is literally about to become the ultimate Passover lamb.
That's the connection. The 1122 sermon points out that just as the Israelites were led out of physical slavery by the blood on a wooden doorpost, Jesus is initiating a new exodus.
Where his blood on the wood of the cross allows the judgment of God to pass over us, freeing us from the slavery of sin.
You've got it. And that profound exchange introduces a core theological concept that the 1122 sermon really emphasizes. It's called alien righteousness.
Alien righteousness. It sounds a little bit like a sci-fi term.
It does, but it's heavily rooted in Romans chapter 3. The premise is stark, really. It basically says that humanity is fundamentally incapable of generating the moral perfection required to stand in the unshielded presence of a holy God.
Like, no amount of good behavior is going to balance the ledger.
Exactly.
I want to make sure the mechanics of alien righteousness are totally clear for everyone listening because it is so important. So think of it like double entry accounting.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Let's say my personal bank account of righteousness is completely overdrawn. In fact, it's totally bankrupt. I can't just magically generate $1 billion to pay off my massive debt. I need an external benefactor.
Someone outside the system.
Right. Someone completely outside of my own financial ruin to wire funds into my account. I need wealth that is alien to me.
That is the exact mechanism. You need a righteousness that is entirely foreign to your nature. So Jesus, who possesses perfect, infinite righteousness, goes to the cross to absorb the debt of our unrighteousness.
The Passover lamb.
Right. And in exchange, he credits his perfect alien righteousness to our empty account. So Moses and Elijah are standing there on the mountain, basically validating that Jesus is the only one who can actually clear the ledger.
But wait, consider the timing of this whole board meeting on the mountain. Jesus already knows the plan.
Right?
He knows he's the Passover lamb. So who is this incredible display actually for?
That's a great question.
Because it seems highly unlikely that the omnipotent Son of God needed a pep talk from two ancient prophets. I mean, this has to be a theatrical display specifically designed for the disciples' benefit.
The timeline makes that deduction absolutely correct. Look at what happened just 6 days prior at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus revealed to his closest friends for the very first time that he was going to Jerusalem to be tortured and killed.
And they did not handle that well.
No, they were utterly devastated. Peter even tried to rebuke Jesus for saying it.
Which is a bold move.
Right. But their entire worldview was built on this expectation of a conquering king who would basically slaughter the Romans. They could not process a suffering servant. Ah, okay.
So this mountaintop revelation is an anchor for the disciples. It is visual, undeniable proof that the horrific violence that's coming in Jerusalem is not an accident, and Jesus is not a failure. It is the orchestrated climax of history.
But the problem is, when human beings are confronted with overwhelming divine glory, we don't usually take notes and quietly absorb the lesson.
No, we definitely do not.
We panic, and we try to control the situation. Which leads right into Peter's reaction here, which is honestly both hilarious and deeply tragic.
Just classic Peter.
It really is. Peter sees the glowing savior of the world conversing with the titans of his faith, and he just blurts out, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah."
The 11:22 sermon diagnoses Peter's reaction here as main character syndrome.
Oh, that is so good.
Isn't it? It's a modern psychological term for someone who subconsciously believes the universe revolves around their personal narrative.
Right, like they're the star of the movie and everyone else is just an extra. Exactly. Peter is standing in the middle of the most pivotal moment in cosmic history, and his instinct is to insert himself as the event coordinator.
Let me handle the logistics, guys.
He essentially says, "This is great, but it really needs my management."
But the supplemental context we looked at shows he wasn't just offering to be a, wilderness real estate developer, right? The tents or booths he mentions are a highly specific cultural reference.
Oh, absolutely. Peter is referencing the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot.
Okay, what is that?
This was an annual festival where Israelites built temporary shelters to commemorate how God dwelled with them during their wandering in the wilderness. It was a massive season of rejoicing.
Ah, so Peter isn't just suggesting they camp out for the night.
No, he is trying to initiate a permanent festival. He wants to manufacture an endless spiritual high and freeze time so they never have to go back down into the messy, dangerous reality of the valley.
He wants the crown without the cross. He wants the mountaintop without the exodus that Jesus and Moses were just discussing. But God completely shuts Peter's event planning down.
Just immediately.
Yeah. While Peter is literally still rambling, this terrifying bright cloud overshadows them. And as the 11:22 sermon points out, the disciples know their Torah. They know what a cloud on a mountain means.
It immediately triggers the cultural memory of Mount Sinai in Exodus 19.
Right.
When the presence of God descended on Sinai, it arrived in thick, terrifying clouds with a very strict warning. If anyone touched the mountain, the sheer, unshielded holiness of God would kill them instantly.
Because holiness is lethal to corruption.
Exactly. When that cloud drops over Peter, James, and John, they aren't thinking it's a pleasant weather anomaly. They are bracing for execution.
And out of that lethal, terrifying cloud, God the Father speaks. And he ignores Peter entirely.
Doesn't even acknowledge the tent idea.
Nope. He just says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And this command, "listen to him," is where the 11:22 pastor builds this incredibly convicting modern application.
It's so powerful.
It is, because if we aren't actively listening to Jesus, we don't just live in silence. We default to listening to one of 3 other voices. And the first voice that fills the void is the world.
Yeah, and the sermon describes the voice of the world as the ultimate bait and switch.
How so?
Well, the world baits you down a road of endless consumption with the promise of deep satisfaction. The pastor uses the phrase cotton candy and Cadillacs.
Oh, I like that.
Right. The world insists that status or wealth or physical pleasure or, internet clout will fill the existential void inside you, but it's an illusion.
Just empty calories.
Exactly. It baits you down the road, taking your time, your energy, your morals. And when you finally reach the end and realize you are still utterly hollow, the world just laughs at you.
It's basically an economic system built on your eventual dissatisfaction.
That's a great way to summarize it.
But if the world can't distract you, the second voice steps in. The enemy.
Yeah. Where the world tries to distract you, the enemy tries to disqualify you. The sermon notes that the enemy's primary language involves lies, fear, and condemnation.
Just constant accusation.
Constant. The enemy whispers that your past is too dark, or your failures are too numerous, and your secret addictions make you completely unfit for God's use. It is a voice specifically designed to paralyze you with guilt.
And if that wasn't having enough, we arrive at the third voice. The 11:122 sermon argues this is actually the most dangerous voice of all, because it's the closest to you.
Right. The third voice is yourself.
Yeah. The pastor bluntly states, "You are a terrible prophet to yourself."
Which is so painfully true.
It really is. We talk down to ourselves in ways we would never tolerate from a friend. We constantly break our own promises to ourselves.
And the psychology behind this is just devastating. The danger, as the sermon points out, is this closed-loop system of despair.
Explain that closed-loop idea.
Well, when your ears hear your own mouth speak failure, your brain processes it as reality, and then your heart begins to feel it as an inescapable truth. You literally construct your own prison out of your own negative internal monologue.
Wow.
This is why God the Father's command on the mountain is basically an urgent rescue mission. Listen to him. You have to break the closed loop by introducing an external authoritative voice.
But let me push back on the mechanics of that for a second. Because it's easy for a preacher to stand on a stage and say, stop listening to yourself. But we are biologically wired to process our own internal monologue.
Right, you can't just turn your brain off.
Exactly. It's running 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
So how do you practically shut down your own voice on like a random Tuesday when your anxiety is just spiraling?
Well, the key is you don't just shut it down, you overwrite it. The 1122 solution is active displacement.
Okay, active displacement.
Yeah, nature abhors a vacuum, right? If you simply tell your brain to stop thinking anxious thoughts, it will just fixate on the anxiety of trying not to be anxious. The application is actively, intentionally speaking the word of God over yourself.
Oh, it makes me think of how noise-canceling headphones actually work.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, because they don't just magically block sound with thick foam. They actively listen to the chaotic noise of, say, an airplane cabin, and then they broadcast a perfectly inverted audio wave to neutralize the chaos.
Exactly.
So you have to broadcast the inverted wave of Scripture to neutralize the chaos of your own terrible prophecies.
That is a perfect mechanical analogy. It requires knowing the text well enough that when your internal voice says, you are a failure and beyond repair, you actively broadcast Romans 8 out loud. There's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus.
You train your ears to hear the promises of God coming out of your own mouth.
Yes. But back on the mountain, the disciples haven't learned this yet. They hear the terrifying voice of God, and they just fall on their faces in absolute dread.
Which brings us to a point of logical necessity. If the unshielded holiness of God is fatal to flawed humans, as we talked about, the disciples are currently bracing for death.
We think it's over.
Right. So the only way they survive this encounter, logically, is if that holiness is somehow shielded or satisfied, and that exact mechanism of satisfaction arrives in the form of a physical touch.
Right. Jesus comes over.
Jesus comes over, touches them, and says, "Rise and have no fear."
This is where the 1122 sermon anchors us in the mechanics of propitiation.
Propitiation. That's a big theological word.
It is, but it's crucial. The disciples are terrified because justice demands that sin be punished. The wrath of God against corruption is a real thing. But propitiation is defined as a payment that satisfies.
Okay.
When Jesus touches them and tells them not to fear, he is acting as that propitiation. He is about to absorb the entirety of that wrath on the cross, making the payment that fully satisfies the justice of God.
And the 1122 pastor distills that heavy theological ledger into the best, most approachable phrasing possible. He just says, "God ain't mad at you."
I love that line.
It's so good. Because of propitiation, the anger has been spent, The debt is zeroed out. Your failures don't define your standing anymore. Jesus' payment does.
And this completely rewires the human operating system. The sermon shares a really fascinating piece of data here. Variations of the command, fear not or do not be afraid, appear 366 times in Scripture.
Wow,
Yeah.
366.
One for every single day of the year, including leap years. It highlights the drastic shift between the Old Covenant, which rightly induced fear because the law exposed our failures, and the New Covenant of grace, which demands fearlessness because the law has been fulfilled on our behalf.
But the command to live fearlessly feels almost like economic treason today.
How do you mean?
Think about it. Fear is a multi-billion-dollar algorithm. The 1122 pastor points out how fear makes you click the rage bait link. Fear keeps your eyes glued to the 24-hour news cycle through the commercial breaks. Fear drives consumer spending.
Oh, absolutely. It's profitable.
So to look at the chaos of the world and genuinely have no fear is an act of total rebellion against the modern economy of anxiety.
It is deeply subversive.
Yeah.
When you aren't motivated by the fear of missing out or the fear of political collapse or the fear of social rejection, you become incredibly difficult for the world to manipulate.
You're off the grid emotionally.
Exactly. The command to rise and have no fear isn't just about personal comfort. It is about freeing you to act out of love rather than self-preservation. And the disciples are going to need every ounce of that fearlessness because they cannot stay on the mountain.
Right. They have to descend.
Yeah.
And the whiplash from the peak down to the valley is just brutal. Looking at the synoptic comparisons, how Matthew, Mark, and Luke all report this descent, it sets a really chaotic stage.
Bit of a mess.
Jesus, Peter, James, and John walk down the mountain and plunge directly into a riot. There was a massive crowd, a group of religious scribes arguing vehemently with the other 9 disciples, a desperate father, and a boy who is being violently tormented by a demonic spirit.
The contrast is just jarring. The Enduring Word commentary quotes the theologian G. Campbell Morgan, who captures the absolute dissonance of the moment perfectly.
What does he say?
He writes, "They're glorified saints. Here the lunatic, there the king in his heavenly glory. Here the representatives of baffled and beaten faith.
Man.
It is the highest high and the lowest low, separated by just a brief walk."
And what Jesus finds at the bottom of the hill is a damning indictment of his own followers. The 1122 sermon delivers a very sharp critique here. Let's look at the actual scenario.
Okay, paint the picture.
You have a boy who, according to Mark's medical and spiritual diagnosis, has been seized by a spirit since childhood. It makes him mute, throws him to the ground, and repeatedly throws him into fire and water to destroy him. A human being is suffering unimaginable agony right in front of them.
Right.
And what are the 9 disciples doing? They are locked in a pedantic theological debate with the scribes.
They have completely lost the plot. A bleeding, suffering family is right in front of them, and they are prioritizing winning an argument.
It's infuriating.
It is. And the 1122 pastor draws a brilliant, uncomfortable parallel to the modern church here. He equates the arguing disciples to keyboard warriors and Instagram grifters.
Oh, that hits close to home.
Right. These are people who spend all their time, their energy, and their digital platforms endlessly debating who has the purest doctrine or writing hit pieces on other Christians while entirely ignoring the real suffering people in their actual neighborhoods.
He uses this fantastic rural analogy in the sermon. Arguing on the internet is like wrestling a pig. Everybody gets dirty and the pig loves it.
That is so accurate.
The scribes are the pig in this scenario. They want the debate. They want the controversy. And the disciples got into the mud with them while a boy was literally burning in a fire.
And Jesus is just utterly exasperated. He calls them a faithless and twisted generation because true religion isn't about crushing your opponents in a theological debate. It's about visiting orphans and widows in their affliction.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I know there are listeners who deeply value robust theology. The scribes were likely attacking the core of Jesus' authority or accusing the disciples of heresy. Doesn't theology matter? I mean, if we don't aggressively defend the truth, doesn't the truth degrade? When exactly does defending orthodox theology devolve into the pig wrestling that Jesus hates?
Well, theology is critical. It is the study of the nature of God. But the dividing line is priority and posture.
Explain that.
The New Testament commands believers to contend for the faith. Absolutely. However, it also explicitly warns against foolish controversies that breed division. When winning a theological debate takes precedence over alleviating actual human suffering, your theology has become a weapon of the ego, not an instrument of grace.
Wow.
Ministry and compassion must precede empty debate. If your pristine theology doesn't compel you to roll up your sleeves and help a broken addict or a desperate father, then your theology is practically useless. Jesus isn't condemning theology. He is condemning hypocrisy that masquerades as theology.
That distinction is so important. The theology must have hands and feet.
Ex-
So cutting through the pointless noise of the scribes, the desperate father finally pushes his way to Jesus.
Yeah.
And this father embodies the exact tension of faith that I think almost everyone listening to this right now wrestles with.
The trauma this man carries is staggering. He tells Jesus the Spirit has tormented his son from childhood. Think of the years of hypervigilance, the sleepless nights, the sheer terror of watching your child throw themselves into a fire, and the crushing inability to stop it.
It's heartbreaking.
He brings this exhausted, shattered reality to Jesus. Because the disciples have already failed him, he says, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us."
And Jesus instantly challenges the phrasing, if you can. All things are possible for one who believes. And the father responds with what might be the most honest, paradoxical prayer in the entire Bible.
It's incredible.
He cries out with tears, I believe, help my unbelief.
Which sounds like a logical contradiction at first.
Yeah, how can belief and unbelief coexist simultaneously?
Right. To understand this, we bring in John Calvin's commentary from our supplemental stack. Calvin points out that this paradox is the precise spiritual reality of every single believer.
Okay, how so?
We have a genuine seed of trust in God, we partly believe, but we are simultaneously weighed down by the massive remains of our own infidelity. We are burdened by our doubts, our fears, and the heavy trauma of our lived experiences. Faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive in the human heart. They are often roommates.
Charles Spurgeon's insight here is so comforting, too. He points out that the very act of asking Jesus to fix your lack of faith is, in itself, an act of faith.
That's a profound thought.
If the father had zero faith, he would have packed up his son and gone home when the disciples failed.
Yeah.
But his fragile, battered faith drives him to ask the source of faith for a refill.
It is the raw honesty that moves Jesus. And the 11:22 sermon applies this to the heavy, agonizing realities where listeners find themselves praying this exact prayer today.
What kind of realities?
The pastor lists scenarios that strip away all our polished religious veneers. Parents watching a prodigal child self-destruct, families facing sudden financial ruin, or patients sitting in a sterile clinic waiting for terrifying biopsy results.
The pastor also specifically mentions the deep, silent agony of infertility.
That was a heavy part of the sermon.
It was. He points out the profound, seemingly cruel irony of the world. People who seem entirely ill-equipped and reckless easily have children, while faithful, loving couples desperately pray and spend their life savings on treatments, only to face another negative test.
Yeah.
In those valleys, your theology is stripped down to the studs. You aren't offering a polished, deeply confident prayer. You are weeping and saying, I know you are good, but this feels cruel. I believe. Help my unbelief.
Yes, it is the cry of a soul holding on to God with one hand while feeling the earth crumble beneath their feet.
But look at the contrast here. The father brings a flawed, doubting, panicked plea to Jesus. It's like bringing a half-built, crumbling bridge to God and saying, I know it's structurally unsound, but can you still walk across it?
I love that analogy.
And Jesus honors it. He heals the boy instantly. But moments ago, Jesus rebuked the disciples for their lack of faith. Why does Jesus honor the father's flawed faith, but condemn the disciples' flawed faith? What is the mechanical difference?
The mechanical difference is the posture of self-reliance versus total bankruptcy.
Okay, unpack that.
The father knows he is entirely out of options. He openly confesses his inability and throws himself entirely on the mercy of Christ. The disciples, conversely, had fallen into the trap of self-reliance.
Oh, wow.
As the 1122 sermon notes, back in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus had given them authority to cast out demons, and they had seen incredible success.
Right, they'd done this before.
Exactly. So when this father brought his boy to them, they didn't rely on God in the moment. They relied on their past resume. They treated the exorcism like a religious technique they had mastered. They forgot the power didn't reside in their own vocal cords. Jesus rebukes the disciples for their spiritual pride, but he honors the Father for his desperate dependence.
which is a terrifying warning for anyone who has been in the faith for a long time. It is dangerously easy to rely on your habits, your routines, and your past successes, instead of maintaining a vibrant, dependent relationship with God today.
It's a subtle drift.
So Jesus heals the boy. The crowd is amazed. Later, in private, the humiliated disciples pull Jesus aside and ask, "Why couldn't we cast it out?"
And Jesus' diagnostic answer is brilliant. In Matthew's account, he tells them it was because of their little faith and then introduces the concept of mustard seed faith. In Mark's account, he bluntly states, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer.
Our supplemental source from Henri Nouwen captures the tragedy of the disciples' failure perfectly here.
What did Nguyen say?
Nouwen wrote about the danger of separating ministry from spirituality. He warned that we often treat prayer as a luxury, something we do when we have free time, rather than a strict operational necessity.
Ouch.
Right. The disciples thought they were too busy doing the heavy lifting of ministry to actually stop and depend on the king. They substituted religious activity for intimacy.
And when Jesus explains mustard seed faith, he's correcting a fundamental misunderstanding of how faith operates. The disciples assumed they needed a massive volume of faith to accomplish a massive work.
Like filling up a gas tank.
Right. But Jesus points to the smallest seed in their agricultural world to prove that the size of the faith is irrelevant. What matters entirely is the object and the direction of the faith.
So it's not about how much you have.
Exactly. A tiny, microscopic sliver of faith placed in the hands of an omnipotent God can move a mountain. But a massive, overwhelming amount of faith placed in your own abilities or your own religious techniques cannot cast out a single demon.
It's not the volume. It's the velocity and the target.
Yes.
That is incredibly free. You don't have to muster up some heroic level of spiritual energy. You just have to aim your tiny, battered faith at Jesus. But this brings us back to the massive mystery we opened the show with.
The missing verse.
Yes. Jesus explains the mechanics of faith in Matthew 17:20. But if you read the very next verse in a modern translation like the ESV or the NIV, it skips straight to verse 22. Verse 21 is just a tiny footnote.
This is a fascinating dive into the mechanics of textual criticism. If you grew up reading the King James Version, translated in 1611, verse 21 is right there in the main text.
And it reads, "Howbeit this kind Ekbers goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting."
Right. So the natural, often alarmed question is, did modern scholars just arbitrarily decide they didn't like fasting and delete a verse from the Bible?
It sounds like a massive conspiracy, like they're removing instructions on spiritual warfare.
It looks suspicious, but understanding the methodology of textual criticism proves it is actually a beautiful testament to the integrity of modern translations.
Okay, let's hear the defense.
We rely on the Mike Leake analysis in the Text of the Gospel supplement here. When the brilliant scholars of 1611 translated the King James Bible, they were working with a relatively small handful of Greek manuscripts, most of which dated from the Middle Ages. But over the last 400 years, archaeology has uncovered vastly older, far more reliable manuscripts like the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus.
And those date back to when?
All the way back to the 300s AD.
Oh, wow. So they got much closer to the original source material.
Exactly. And when they unrolled those ancient manuscripts, Matthew 17:21 simply wasn't there.
It just did not exist in the earliest records of Matthew's gospel.
No. So the detective work begins. How did it get into the medieval copies that the King James translators used?
Right, someone had to write it.
The consensus among scholars is an accidental transmission error. Centuries ago, a well-meaning scribe was copying the Gospel of Matthew by hand. This scribe knew his Bible well, and he knew that in Mark's parallel account of this exact story, Jesus says, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer."
Mark 9:29.
Correct. So the scribe likely wrote Mark's phrase in the margin of his Matthew scroll as a helpful cross-reference for future readers.
Like a handwritten study note.
Exactly. But decades later, the next scribe who came along to copy that manuscript saw the sentence floating in the margin. Without modern formatting rules, he assumed a previous copyist had accidentally omitted a sentence from the main text.
Oh, no.
Yep. Trying to be faithful, he inserted the marginal note directly into the narrative of Matthew. As that manuscript was copied over the next 1,000 years, the insertion became solidified as verse 21.
That is wild.
And it gets even deeper. When you look at Mark 9:29 in those ancient 4th century texts, the words "and fasting" are also missing.
Wait, really?
Yes, it originally just said by prayer. The and fasting was added centuries later by monastic scribes who highly valued the ascetic practice of fasting and subconsciously or intentionally embellished the text to reflect their monastery's practices.
Let's pause and process this, because for a lot of people, the idea of scholars removing words from the Bible feels like a direct attack on its authority. If
Mhm.
they can carve out verse 21, how can we trust any of the verses?
It's a completely understandable fear. But when you understand the mechanics, it proves the exact opposite. It proves the absolute ruthless integrity of modern translation committees.
How so?
These scholars are not deleting verses to hide theological truths. I mean, Jesus talks openly and approvingly about fasting in the Sermon on the Mount. There is no anti-fasting agenda. What these scholars are doing is painstakingly stripping away centuries of accidental scribal errors and well-meaning medieval additions to get back to the purest, most original text possible.
Okay, it's like an art historian restoring a priceless ancient painting.
Yes, exactly.
Over hundreds of years, various owners might have added a layer of varnish here or touched up the paint there. The restorer has to meticulously strip away those later additions. They aren't destroying the painting, they're revealing the original masterpiece exactly as the artist painted it. Moving verse 21 to a footnote is a dedication to historical truth.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. And the core theological truth of the passage remains fiercely intact, regardless of the scribal additions. The disciples failed in the valley because they relied on their own power instead of relying on God through prayer.
So let's pull all of these threads together and synthesize this massive journey we've just
And
taken.
it's been a long hike.
It has. We started at the absolute peak, on the mountain of transfiguration. We saw the unshielded, blinding glory of Jesus radiating from within. We watched the law and the prophets validate his mission. We unpacked the mechanics of alien righteousness, the reality that we are bankrupt, but Jesus credits his perfect surplus to our account.
And we experienced the terrifying holiness of God, followed immediately by the touch of grace. The command to rise and have no fear because the propitiation has been made, the debt is settled, God is not mad at you. And we learn that living fearlessly is the ultimate subversion of a world that profits off our anxiety.
The reality of faith is that you cannot build a tent and stay on the mountain.
No, you have to go back down.
The true test of that mountaintop glory is whether it survives the brutal descent into the valley of human suffering. We walked down into the chaos of the arguing scribes, the humiliated disciples, and the suffering boy. We saw the intense danger of relying on our past successes, of prioritizing theological internet battles over actual, bleeding human compassion.
We witnessed the profound, messy honesty of a father who is at the end of his rope crying out, "I believe, help my unbelief." We learned that faith doesn't have to be massive to be miraculous. It just has to be directed at the right object, like a microscopic mustard seed placed in the hands of an omnipotent God.
The 1122 sermon calls this the upside-down kingdom. It's a kingdom where you don't need a flawless spiritual resume to gain entry. You don't need perfect, unshakable theology, and you don't even need unwavering faith. You just need the total, bankrupt honesty to come to Jesus with your brokenness and say, help my unbelief.
And Jesus honors that raw dependence infinitely more than his. He honors the polished, self-reliant religious professional who forgot how to pray.
It is an invitation to absolute authenticity. The kingdom of heaven belongs to those who know they are out of options.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over in your own life. It builds on everything we've unpacked today. Look at your own struggles, your own anxieties, and your own faith right now. Are you currently acting like Peter on the mountain, frantically trying to build a tent to permanently capture a past spiritual high, terrified of engaging with the messy reality of the valley?
Or are you acting like the 9 disciples in the valley, relying on yesterday's success, treating your faith like a routine, and fighting pointless battles online, all while forgetting to actually stop and depend on God?
True greatness in this upside-down kingdom doesn't mean staying safely sequestered on the mountain. It means carrying the blinding, radiant light of that mountain down into the darkest, most broken, most desperate parts of the valley.
The mountaintop is where we see his glory, but the valley is where we prove our faith.
Don't be afraid of the descent. Rise, have no fear, and carry the light.